Welcome everybody to the afternoon sessions of our workshops. I am Joanna Kuzmova. I teach at the International Human Rights Clinic here in Boston University School of Law. And it's my pleasure and honor to be moderating our panel on the legal challenges presented by the human trafficking migration nexus. So I will very briefly introduce our panelists today and then let them introduce themselves at greater length. First, we'll hear from Mr. Jan van Dijk, who comes from the Council of Europe's group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings. But he has a quite illustrious career previously in the Dutch Ministry of Justice. He is a professor of victimology and human security, emeritus at the University of Tilburg. He will start with some opening remarks about the group of experts on action against human trafficking in human beings, as you can see. Then we'll hear from Hernan del Valle, who comes from Doctors Without Borders. He's the head of Humanitarian Affairs and Advocacy and has been in this field for the past 15 years, working pretty much everywhere around the world. As far as I can tell, he'll share some of his experience from the field. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Amira Ahmed Mohamed, who is a scholar with at Northeastern University with Carnegie-BCARS. She also has significant field experience as with the International Organization for Migration in the Middle East. She has advocated for migrant rights, formulated response strategy, conducted research and evaluation. She's held academic positions at the American University of Cairo and is currently here in Boston. And finally, we'll hear from my distinguished colleague, Julie Dahlstrom, who co-directs the Boston University School of Law Immigrants' Rights and Human Trafficking Clinic. Julie has founded this clinic back in 2012, and in 2014, the Human Trafficking Clinic was recognized by Pre-Law magazine as one of the top 25 most innovative clinical programs nationally. So with this very brief introduction, I'll hand it over to Mr. van Dijk. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, I'm a member of GRETA. GRETA is the monitoring mechanism of the Council of Europe Convention of Action Against Human Trafficking. What we do is that we assess the compliance of the member states of the Council of Europe with the so-called Warsaw Convention. So we visit the country and we publish reports which are in the public domain on their level of compliance with the different requirements of that convention. Obviously, the migration and human trafficking nexus is one of our current priorities. It wasn't so much a few years ago, but now it is. We always look very much whether the country makes sufficient efforts to identify possible victims of human trafficking. Then we look whether they provide the services that they are and the protection that they're entitled to. And finally, and probably most importantly, nowadays we always very much look whether they comply with the convention requirement that you must offer a protective environment, particularly to minors, in order to prevent them from being recruited by smugglers or traffickers. Instead of elaborating on these priorities, I decided to just show you a few pictures that I took myself during recent missions in Hungary and Serbia. First, we see a reception center. You see it's an old building. It's a little bit of a chateau kind of building. You see here that there are people living on the balcony. Winter hadn't started yet. You also see here army tents, hundreds of people living there in a very basic accommodation. The next, you see the main hall of this center. We see some young people here making the victory sign to me. We also see a mother with a baby. It's a very mixed group of people who live together, hundreds of them in this deserted old chateau. Here we see a volunteer of the Red Cross. She offers information and does awareness raising among the people in that reception center about human trafficking. Here we see two of the target groups, two young girls in the center, one of them showing the leaflet. Here we see a scene from the neighboring country. This is the famous wall in Hungary. You see it's a very effective border wall between the border of Hungary and Serbia. Here we see, this is very interesting. This is the border of Hungary. We are here on Hungarian territory. This is Serbian territory. They put the containers outside their own territory, also in order to create a little bit of legal mist. So they are basically detained in containers while they are waiting for their asylum claim to be studied. The government denies very much that this is a detention situation, but if they leave, and they can leave because this is Serbia, their asylum application is dismissed. So they have no options other than to stay there. There are quite a number of unaccompanied minors in these containers, also living here in that situation, minors from 14 years and onwards. Now, what is interesting, I think, for the moment, and this is the most urgent crisis that we now are confronted with, is that basically Hungary has completely closed off the border. They allow about 5 persons per week into these containers. But this means that the people that we have seen before in the reception center are completely stuck. When I was in Serbia 2 years ago, there were many unaccompanied minors. Most of them would disappear within a week. That was fairly common. There wasn't much they did about this. They couldn't really care because they went to Germany. Now the situation is very, very different because they can no longer go to Germany. So what we are now confronted with is that these girls are stuck. In the old days, they were there just for a few days. They took a shower and had some meals, and then they went to the central station. They were gone. Now we are absolutely sure these hundreds of unaccompanied minors in the reception centers in Serbia will be stuck. And then the big question is, this is the entrance of another reception center. You will see here, there is absolutely zero security. There is no security whatsoever. You have these nice volunteers from the Red Cross, but they cannot fence off the reception center to the people who are here. Who are these people? I think some of them might very well be smugglers or traffickers. And since these minors, unaccompanied minors, in this strange reception center, which with its mix of inhabitants, I think are very, very vulnerable to be smuggled, but then they will be indebted and basically they will be trafficked. And the services, the protection that is provided by the Serbian government was maybe acceptable 2 years ago when these unaccompanied minors were in transition anyway. Now they are stuck. And I think that the situation that we find in these reception centers now in Serbia, but also in other parts of the European Union, in Italy, in Greece, really are extremely, extremely worrying because we are almost certain that a fair percentage of the unaccompanied minors stuck in these centers will be trafficked this year or next year, because there is no other way for them to go. They can't go back and they can't go in, so they will be preyed upon by the traffickers. That is our main concern today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Van Dijk. And now, having heard about the situation that you're observing in Syria, in Serbia, I'm sorry, I think Hernan will take us a little bit farther back on the road to the Mediterranean, that portion of the, yes.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, and it's great to be here. Looking forward to learning a bit from the discussion that comes afterwards. I'm a lawyer. I want to come out of the closet. I'm a reluctant lawyer. I'm not going to be talking about the law. I'm interested in people. I think this is a topic about people. So we can discuss law if there are legal questions. We can, but I think this is really about people. What I represent, I represent Doctors Without Borders. You might know the organization. We have been working with refugees for over 45 years, refugees and migrants. So our entry point to this topic, it's through forced migration. It's through working refugee camps. It's through interacting with people that many years ago we used to see in camps, and now you see them spread in urban cities along routes. And so the experience that I can bring to this is really the frontline health provider, services provider. What can you do as a health provider? The first thing is, of course, detect. We struggled a lot, and we're going to talk about the Mediterranean. We struggled a lot understanding that this was an issue. Trafficking was an issue within the bigger migratory flow. No? You're there, you have patients, you're a doctor, but you don't necessarily know. I think one of the panelists, I think Hani before, talked about how to help health providers identify that. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, once you detect, what can you actually do? And that has to do, what does the victim want? What does the victim need? What's in his or her best interest? What is the legal framework that applies? How does it treat migrants and victims of trafficking? What are the policies in place? What's the daily practice? What do institutions do? And all that is beyond you as an aid agency, right? What services are available for referral? What are the social attitudes towards migrants and victims of trafficking? In fact, are all these things part of the solution or part of the problem? And our experience, I'm going to tell you a bit about this Mediterranean intervention, because I think I'm going to tell you the answer already. I think that these are part of the problem in Europe today. I picked the Mediterranean because I think I could pick Afghanistan or a place in which you could say, okay, there's no functioning state, no functioning services. Here, there's very little excuse. People are arriving in Europe to say, okay, well, all the services are there, resources are there. So the fact that things don't work points at a different kind of political responsibility. It's not about means, it's about will. So make this long story short, we had since 2015, deaths in the Mediterranean we were seeing. In 2015, we said, okay, we're going to put 3 boats in the Med, we're going to rescue people. Since then, we rescued around 16,000 people. The very, very, very small minority of those were victims of trafficking. We found out about it because the group of Nigerian women that come from Edo State, they come with an older woman that seems to be a minder. When interviewed, they said, how old are you? They all are, say, 18 plus, exactly that same. And they all come from the same Benin city and where. So obviously they have a script, and they all have a little piece of paper sewn to their clothes when they're taking out the water. And the first thing they need is a pen and paper, and to just write down a phone number that they need to call in order to go on the. So it was very evident that we put a lot of things in place. We had a cultural mediator. We said, okay, how can we help people approach us? It's a very difficult thing to do on a boat. That you have 24 hours before you disembark people in Italy. We did a massive effort to identify people, to say, okay, these are the services available, refer on arrival to different agencies, to Italian authorities. I could tell you a lot about that, but the bell is going to come. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the challenges, because this is not the interesting part. The interesting part is really what have we learned through this? We've been, over the last year, under fire. We never got so much flack. Trolls on the internet, the European politicians just saying the worst possible things. These NGOs at sea, are working with smugglers and traffickers. You are fueling the problem. to the point we withdrew 2 boats from the Mediterranean recently, and not because of the flag, but because of the fact that the Italians are paying now Libyan militias to stop the flow so people don't come anymore. No? But I'm just going to share a couple of thoughts that we can discuss afterwards. And I think it's, Julie's going to tell you, oh, Jesus. Okay. So anyway, so I think Julie, I'm going to leave this one to Julie, but I mean, who is a victim, what's trafficking, and who's a victim of trafficking, what's trafficking, and how is that categorization being used today by politicians and policymakers? I will let her talk about it, but I feel really uncomfortable that the fight on trafficking has become a proxy for the fight against migration and ultimately for the fight against migrants. And that's a real problem that we have to be, when we want to dismantle the nexus, we have to understand what that nexus is, and let's be careful what agendas we're playing towards. I'm not going to talk, I mean, we had a very good, at lunchtime, what's a European paradigm today to manage migration has a tremendous human cost. There's no way to get to Europe for a refugee, an asylum seeker, or a migrant, but to put yourself in the hands of smugglers and traffickers. So this is a man-made disaster. This is policy that is putting people in a situation of vulnerability. And there's been a massive paradigm shift in terms of how we conceptualize a refugee. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we saw refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, as people that were vulnerable and that they deserved assistance. Today, what's vulnerable is the border. The border is vulnerable, it needs to be protected. I mean, you have written about how the massive growth in terms of securitization of that border, states co-opted to invest in control. This has been done at the cost of human lives. State response is basically designed to tackle a different problem. The state's response today is not to tackle the problem of those people. Let's see how we help people. Is cater to tame the anxieties that European electorates today have about terrorism. Another word is linked to migration. And I'm not going to talk about externalization of this because that was said, and I'm going to leave it here, and I hope there are questions because otherwise, yeah, the rest is known. Thank you.
Thank you, Hernan. Definitely a lot of questions left for us to get back to, but now I'll hand over to Amira, who will share her experience from the Middle East.
Hello, everybody. Like any serious scholar, I prepared a paper for this conference, but with the title, Prostitution of Marriage. But the 5 minutes policy put me back, and I just changed my mind. And I decided to share with you reflection from my 18 years working in the field of migration and / trafficking, human trafficking. So the story of migration, everybody has a story of migration, including myself. I was born in a migrant family in Egypt, so I'm second generation, and I think that would put me in the field of migration. So I spent 18 years up to now, and I'm very old, working on migrants and refugees, and we're isolated group of like bunch of scholars who are crazily talking about migration. Nobody had a clue about what we were talking about. And then came the Arab Spring, and then migration became the story of everybody, and I'm happy. So this is a good moment in my life. So I started my work on migrants and refugees in Egypt and Sudan, and then in the UK, Ethiopia, Switzerland, Jordan, and then back again to Egypt and Sudan, where we did a lot of field work only last month with my colleagues from BCARS, Alison Hawkins, and Professor Dennis Sullivan. So I worked in the migration field in different capacities. I worked again in NGOs sector, local NGOs, and then academia, and then international organizations, and the UN, and back again to academia, where I am now at the moment. So through this journey, I just always recall what the writer Audre Lorde said. I'm afraid I'm always defined as an other in every group I'm part of. But being here, I find that you all belong to a huge array of affiliations and disciplines, so I don't think I'm the only one. I came to work on trafficking through my work on domestic workers in Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia, where I did work on migrant domestic workers, local and international refugees as well. And I have always asked myself, what is the link between slavery, like old-time slavery, and modern-day trafficking or slavery? And the question is still standing, and I think that's why I came back to academia, because of that important question. Of significance, I spent 5 years working at the international organization for migration, first in Jordan and then in Egypt, and I was the head of the counter-trafficking, counter-smuggling, and capacity-building unit, both in Egypt and in Jordan. And then through our work, just to give you an idea about what we do in this organization, when we worked on at IOM, we worked with both migrants and citizens who are victims or potential victims or at high risk of trafficking. And then we worked through the 3 pillars, which is prevention, you do training and information campaign, protection, something we call DA, which is direct assistance, or AVRR, which is assisted voluntary repatriation and return. And then the shelter, where we hosted the victims of trafficking and designed rehabilitation plan for the rehabilitation and reintegration again. And then the prosecution, where we delivered a lot of training for law enforcement and other partners. When it comes to refugees, we assisted victims of trafficking who are refugees, but through a memorandum of understanding with UNHCR, our sister organization. So just to take you to Egypt, of course, trafficking is prevalent in Egypt like any other country. There are a lot of cases of trafficking, but the 3 dominant types is smuggling of migrants that can also involve exploitation, and the routes of migration are, ebb and flows from the northern eastern borders through Sinai to Israel, which is now curtailed because of the military operation in Sinai, to the northwestern borders with Libya, that's you have spoken about earlier in your, Barbara, in your intervention. And then in south now, that was traditionally taken by African refugees, but now by also Syrian refugees, because Syrians can enter Sudan without a visa as a stepping stone to get to Egypt. And then from Egypt, of course, to Libya. The second type of trafficking in Egypt is migrants and refugee domestic workers who are engaged in domestic work. And then, most importantly, the tourist or temporary or transaction marriage. In Jordan, of course, migrant workers. There are lots of migrant workers in Jordan, mostly domestic workers, but also the issue of temporary marriage or tourist marriage that's now prevalent among Syrian refugees. And then I was just telling my friend that Jordanians now justify this by saying, خُذ سوريا وعيش هنية, marry a Syrian and live a happy life. So when it comes to Middle Eastern country, and I will try to wrap up, I don't know how, but I'm trying my best here. The Middle East countries constitute a significant host for a great number of VOTs, victims of trafficking. The US report classifies these countries to, none of these countries is in tier 1, they are either in tier 2 or 3, and there are special cases, which is Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia. Type of traffickings, the most prevalent ones are labor trafficking and sexual trafficking. Sexual trafficking, unfortunately, happens mostly under the cover of marriage. And or this is what I call consumable sexualities. And our prostitution of marriage, the paper I wrote, and I'm not presenting today, unfortunately. So, and this type of marriage is finding a fertile ground in the Muslim conservative countries because there is a wide, like a myriad of marriages, informal marriages under Islam that allows this sort of sexual exploitation, which is Orfi, Mut'a, and Misyar marriages. So the issue of trafficking, studying trafficking, now that I'm coming back to academia, I just found that the human trafficking opens, a floodgate for profoundly intersectional issues and loaded and sensitive issues as well. Take, for example, the issue of marriage that's justified. All the Arab countries now have domestic legislation to combat trafficking, but only the Egypt law. I need 1 minute, please. but only the Egyptian law that criminalized sexual trafficking under the cover of marriage. The rest of the countries, no, they don't. We know that ICE is now also advocating for sexual slavery as a form of jihad. We know that families in Egypt and in Jordan and the Syrian refugees and in Turkey and Lebanon as well justify this as a economic survival strategy. And we know that Muslim religious scholars are divided. Some of them say, oh, this is not like a legitimate type of marriage, and others say, no, even the Prophet married Aisha when she was 9 years old. So there is a lot of debate and controversy in the Muslim debates. What's next? What I learned so far from all that, and coming back to academia, as I said, unfortunately, academia is lagging behind in the issue of trafficking. The issue of trafficking is hugely under-theorized and under-researched. We're just following the language of the international community and policymakers. Trafficking is also hugely contextual, and victims of trafficking are not homogeneous group of victims or people. And also trafficking is differentiated. The discourse here in the US, like what I learned from yesterday and today, is it's quite domestic, internal, and it's heavily focused on sex trafficking. While in the Middle East, where I came from, it's all about migrants. This is not our problem. These people, migrants, bring it from abroad. So we are safe, we're fine. It comes with migrants. And also, even though the sexual trafficking is prevalent, but the discourse shuns away. The political discourse does not mention sexual trafficking. They say, oh, trade organs and migrants. And of course, this has repercussions, as you can imagine. For academia, I think it's important that we need to look at the historical legacy and continuity of slavery or modern-day slavery, and why it's still gendered and why it's still racialized. And I have some answers for that out of my research and analysis, but I don't have the time, so maybe it can come in the discussion. Also, trafficking in, this is the third time. Trafficking in conflict situation is very important because you know why. And
You will tell us.
yeah, on the policy level, I think we need to do more research on how to support or assist victims of trafficking in emergency context. That was a big, important issue in Jordan when I worked with Syrian refugees in the refugee camps. And I will stop here, and I'll be happy to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amira. And now, I believe that Julie Daustrom might challenge a little bit the notion that human trafficking has been under-theorized in academia, seeing as she is in legal academia.
I agree with you in that,
okay, let's see.
regard.
But I definitely see that there's a lot to pick up from exactly what you were saying in Julie's presentation. Please go ahead.
This is my 5 minutes start now. So first, I just want to thank the organizers for putting on this very important event about both linking and delinking this idea of migration and human trafficking. I direct as you mentioned, the Immigrants' Rights and Human Trafficking Program. And so, as you can imagine, we're confronting the convergence of these problems every day and directly in representing clients who are survivors of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. I come to this issue primarily, I used to be and continue to be an immigration lawyer, and I used to run an immigration program where we really engaged in humanitarian practice. So representing a wider range of non-citizens in the United States. And I came to this issue of trafficking with some skepticism, thinking that there was a broad framework in the United States and abroad to provide trafficking survivors with rights and also so much interest in whether it's in the legal field or beyond in engaging in this issue, and really finding that while some of that may be true, it still remains very, very difficult for survivors to step forward to engage with the legal system, to receive representation, and to receive protection. And so there were so many issues that we could talk about today, but I'm going to focus big picture, a little macro level on the definition of trafficking and how it's evolved and some of the challenges brought by that. And is this not the clicker? Oh, We'll do it this way. So I also just wanted to say, when talking about immigrants' rights and human trafficking, I often think of Pac-Man or Pac-Person. There's this tendency to sort of gobble up or direct attention away from one discipline or to another for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons is because, as the other panelists mentioned, trafficking involves the convergence of many different things, of different areas of law. So when we're talking today about legal challenges, we're talking about criminal law, immigration law, the civil legal system, different populations, US citizens and non-citizens, and types of trafficking, so labor and sex trafficking. And so it can be hard to talk about all of these things at once, but it is true that these things are starting to converge and have been converging in really profound ways. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's happening in the United States and how this connection has moved forward into the public discourse. So these are a couple of pictures to give you an idea. One, what we're seeing here along the border is this increased, some would say, militarization of our border as well. In the name of trafficking, so increased enforcement at the border, saying that we're focused on trafficking, but using that as one way or one reason behind immigration enforcement efforts. The convergence of immigration and trafficking in human trafficking courts. So in New York, they have a vibrant human trafficking court system that's really designed to serve anyone or divert anyone who's charged with sex for fee in that system to services. We've now heard reports about immigration coming and even sitting in that court and arresting individuals as they are leaving the court. And then the third picture relates to what we've seen, this trend of immigration enforcement targeting parents of undocumented and unaccompanied minors in the US, citing concerns around trafficking. And there have been some cases involving trafficking of minors, but using the little data that we have to create a larger enforcement practice. So to move from this, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the international framework is and how it's informed the U.S. framework, and then how the U.S. framework has expanded in some ways. And this should, I hope, dovetail off of what Beth Keeley spoke about. As you saw, our state trafficking law very much is an expansion of the trafficking concept, and we'll talk a little bit about the implications. So this is a quote from Anne Gallagher, who's one of the architects of the Palermo Protocol, which was passed in 2000, saying, "I have no doubt that the initial enthusiasm for a global agreement on trafficking would have been much less if states had fully understood that its tentacles would eventually reach directly into their factories, farms, fishing boats, and private households." And for many of us, we've seen this expansion and celebrated it. So as an advocate and attorney, it benefits many of my clients that forms of forced labor and other more subtle forms of psychological coercion are recognized as trafficking. And I want to talk a little bit about how that expansion has happened. So this is just the definition of trafficking. I don't know if we've talked too much about it, but I'm not going to go through it. But what I do want to note is that the Palermo Protocol was fairly broad in scope in terms of defining the crime. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I guess I'll just talk a little bit really quickly. Okay, so it was very broad, in part because there was so much of a lack of consensus between different groups who had maybe different ideological frameworks. So you received this definition, which some have called a rigor-free zone, these terms that are underlined that were not defined, even under international law, and left to states to really define the scope of human trafficking and to move from there. And so what we've seen in our law is that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2000 with a somewhat rigorous definition using force, fraud, or coercion, but we've seen an expansion of the definition of trafficking in both rhetoric, which you heard about this morning, and also in the law. And so these are the ways in the law. So you've seen through legislation, so federally, for example, in 2015, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act was passed, adding new actors and defining them as traffickers. So that law defined buyers of sex with minors and buyers of sex with trafficked people as traffickers, so adding new categories. the state laws have broadened considerably, some of them, including our state, the definition of trafficking. So in our state, for example, sex trafficking doesn't require force, fraud, or coercion, has a really broad definition, and as well as labor trafficking. And that has many benefits. So I've often been on the side of advocating for this because let's imagine under our state law, for example, which has a broader framework for labor trafficking, it means that there's greater protections available. So we're pushing the law forward in the sense of immigration relief, arguing that, that these victims should be eligible for relief. And it also bolsters enforcement. So as Beth Keeley was mentioning, with a broader framework, it makes it easier to get at these cases, to prosecute successfully, potentially without the support or cooperation from victims. But it also does involve challenges. And I think more of my presentation is about the need to measure both the benefits and these potential negative external effects. So I'll just briefly mention what those are, and then I will stop. One of the challenges is that it might increase criminal liability for victims. So one of the issues we're seeing in our state, as the definition of sex trafficking has increased, those same survivors may be criminally liable. They could be prosecuted, and we're seeing that happen in some states where they're charged actually with trafficking. And this is not, those who are more involved. People use terms like bottom, that are more involved. These are people who are providing services that would have otherwise been charged with sex for fee in a different framework. We're seeing greater conflict with other frameworks, which I can talk more about in the question and answer section. So as you say that buyers of sex with minors are traffickers, there are other state-level prosecutorial and other frameworks that have been used, and so there's some conflicts between that. And then I think I'll just end with this, which is, I think, the point that's been made throughout this conference, the risk that the trafficking concept can be used to bolster immigration enforcement and other enforcement efforts that have negative impacts, which is a challenge as well. So with that, I'll just end it and invite lots of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. So a whole lot left to talk about. As in previous panels, we will have two people with microphones roaming around. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and they will come reach you so we can all hear your question. We have a question over there, yes?
Hello, I'm Ragat Kalata. I'm a Brandeis student and originally from Eritrea, so a lot of this issue has been very personal. My question is to Amira, and you've been talking that you've been working on the issue of human trafficking and migrants being commodities, and on that issue, and as you have said it, in many cases, human trafficking is both a race issue and a gender issue. So to tackle this issue, what kind of measures or actions have been taken to change on policy advocacy? Let's for example, in case of Egypt, to have a better favorable condition regarding marriage or regarding those to reverse such circumstance, or even women being domestic workers. As we all know, it's a big issue in Middle East. Even in case of Eritrea, a lot of women are victims of this circumstance. So, and what other type of bond has been created with other civil societies? Because this case is intertwined with other crises of gender and being migrant, even an issue of race by itself. So what has been done regarding relationship and policy advocacy?
Thank you. And now we'll take a couple more questions so that we can all go in order. There's a question down here. If someone has the mic, please go ahead, and then we'll get back.
The last point under challenges, Julie, greater ability to use trafficking concept to bolster immigration enforcement efforts, something that we had talked about earlier. For you and some of the other panelists, this question, the legal challenges, therefore, since the border has become sacrosanct, Certainly in Europe, when you look at the Serbian border and Hungarian border, and when you look at this whole notion that we're somehow basically seeing trafficking as tantamount to anti-immigration efforts. What is the legal challenge to basically reconciling that in a way that might be framed for those who've been fighting this issue for a long time? Does that make sense? I think so. All right.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm a student at the Fletcher School, and I have a question for Amira, but I guess any of the other panelists could also speak to it. When talking about migration issues, especially in the Middle East, there often seems to be a siloing of migrants' rights as a completely separate category doesn't have to do with a wider complex of rights that apply to other groups of people. For example, often the discourse of women's rights in the Middle East takes place in complete isolation, in isolation of rights of migrant women, or they're like footnoted at the bottom. So I'm wondering if there are any, in your work with the IOM, Amira, if you've ever seen initiatives to link issues of migrants' rights with women's rights or other categories of rights in policy measures. Thank you.
Women's rights and other migrants' rights, correct?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. So I guess we can start in any order with the questions. I'm sure that even the questions directed to Amira could be addressed by some of our other presenters. But would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for these are two important questions. I will start the question with the case of Eritrean victims of trafficking. In Egypt, when we did our work in Egypt, to identify a victim of trafficking, we go through like a standardized process. So we get to know about the victim either from the hotline that's run by the Ministry of Social Development in Egypt, or some of the victims, especially migrants, they come and knock the door of the organization. So we do a screening, something called screening, a very long form, 20 pages. We sit with the victim and we talk to them, and then we have this like indicators, like a number of indicators. If they meet these indicators, that means they are victims of trafficking or potential victim of trafficking. Unfortunately, the government of Egypt was always putting a lot of challenges to us, saying that they cannot, unless this goes to the court and becomes a court case, you cannot call them victims of trafficking. But for the sake of providing assistance, we call them potential victims of trafficking. So there was a lady that I work with, and a good friend of mine. She was smuggled from Sudan to Egypt through Sinai to be able to go to Israel, where she was caught up by smugglers and traffickers, and she was trafficked. She had to do like forced labor, and she was raped in Sinai. And they would ask the Bedouin, gangs asked her to pay a ransom. So she had to call her relatives here and there. Fortunately, they were able to pay the money, and she was released. And now she's in Cairo. So only a month ago, she was arrested in the street, like document verification by the police, by the Egyptian police, and she was held in custody for 10 days. Before that, of course, she was recognized as a refugee by UNHCR, and she was assisted by IOM as a VOT, victim of trafficking. But then when she was arrested, we reported the case to UNHCR, and that helped a lot to expedite her case. And now she's in a resettlement program to the US. So she will join very soon. So what I want to say, unfortunately, trafficking is very, very, Eritreans are like a big target of trafficking. And traffickers know that because they know that they have family connection, they have a large diasporic communities or relatives who can pay the ransom. So they are targeted by traffickers. And some of them were able to pay, but also some others were assisted by local Bedouin families to get out of the trafficking situation. Women in general are targeted by traffickers because it's easy to hold them in custody. And as I said, it has legacy and historical legacy and the gendered, type of slavery / trafficking, because women, at least in that part of the world, were used to sexual, exploitation. If you look at the history of slavery, the transatlantic slavery trade was 1.2 male to female to male. Unlike the Indian Ocean slavery trade, which is 3 female to 1 male. So you can see here that women were favored. For the efforts, Palermo Protocol, the international protocol, recognized women and children as target, and it's called the Protocol to Combat Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. Prevention, there are measures of preventions like doing research and media campaigns, but also in Jordan, for example, we identified families that are at high risk. There is something called vulnerability criteria where we can measure the family against this vulnerability criteria. For example, a family that has 7 daughters would be at high risk to sell one of the daughters into marriage for their survival. So we do the same thing also in Egypt to identify the potential victims of trafficking, and we give them some sort of assistance. It might help for a while, but is not guaranteed to help forever. The authorities are not helping us to work with civil society. It's almost forbidden. And just to give you the news, civil society now in Egypt is all closed. There is no NGOs working, and there is a new law that puts a lot of restriction on their work. So this actually somehow corresponds to your question about women's rights and other migrants' rights. We do also positive discrimination in our intervention and provision of assistance at IOM. We give women priority, so especially if they are victims of trafficking. So we work under, especially Jordan was somehow better, the atmosphere there. We did a lot of work with female domestic workers who came from Southeast Asia, from Sri Lanka and Philippines and Bangladesh. So the government was helping. They had a special unit to counter trafficking in the public police. And there is a shelter, of course. Most of the shelters for the host victims of trafficking are female shelter, which is not the best case scenario. We should have both women and men. But just to tell you that women are recognized at more risk of trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you, Amira. Julie, would you like to respond to the overarching question, which I think should be open to everyone else? How do we create those connections between, how do we frame trafficking such that it is not a strategy against migration?
Yeah, and I want to, my sense, Philip, you were also asking this question of how do we establish sort of distinctions between and among smuggling and trafficking? Maybe I'm pulling out too much. So one thing that I think is interesting is that the law is fairly rigorous. So there are very distinct legal definitions for those terms, and without going into them, smuggling is generally thought to be a crime against the border, whereas trafficking is a crime against the person, and there are different elements that you would have to prove. So one of the benefits of that is that there is some clarity. So my one response to that would be, in terms of the rhetoric, to hold reporters and in the press to the same standards in using that. And this goes back to our first panel. An example of this is there was this horrific trailer accident, massacre in San Antonio, and the term human trafficking was applied to it, where there wasn't necessarily evidence of trafficking. It was smuggling, and it was horrific. And so, but the press really used that term in labeling it. So labeling things effectively, but also, are these things connected? Of course. And so I just want to really quickly say, the current administration is taking the approach of increasing immigration enforcement and separately being very supportive of anti-trafficking efforts, at least in terms of the rhetoric. And I believe it is impossible to do both of those things at the same time. And that immigration enforcement necessarily will, number one, increase the vulnerability of people in situations of trafficking or vulnerability to trafficking, and also results in those people not reporting to law enforcement or receiving immigration benefits. And we're seeing that play out nationally. But with that, I'll just defer to others.
Please, Hernan.
I think that was a brilliant answer. So I would have said all that if she already said it. But I think probably the only thing I would add is like, we need to delink the two things, right? I think that from our experiences, what the legal challenge is you need to, regarding to trafficking, you need to start from the people. You need to start it needs to be victim-centered. It needs to be victim-friendly. And I think that in the case of the Nigerian women that I was telling you about that were disembarked in Italy, I think the number of women that actually stayed in the center that we refer them to and the authorities refer them is probably zero. They had guys waiting outside, and as soon as they could, they just get it, and they continued. They went back on again into the trip. And today, I mean, Italy, it's full. You go to Rome, you see where they are, right? So because getting out of it, it's also not a desirable option. You left somewhere in Sicily without resources. What do we know? Are the families under threat? What have they? So the system is not designed to help people. And regarding migration, for me, it's a completely different problem. And that's why I think it's brilliant of what Julie said. You cannot, at the same time, try to just close, fortify your borders, talk about travel bans and building walls, and then pretend that that's not going to have an impact on people trying to cross. It's a fact that there's a mobility market. People move across borders. They have been moving across borders. I grew up in Argentina. My parents from Italy, from Spain, they came to Argentina as immigrants 3 generations ago. You know, they were received with open arms. You know, people move. People will continue to move because of conflict, because of. So what states need to do in terms of law, you need to reclaim the mobility market. Today you are leaving it to smugglers, to traffickers. You need a policy and a legal framework around it. It's like, this is a fact of life. We need to just think of it differently. We need to facilitate it. You cannot think of this as a terror threat and keep agitating that irresponsible discourse, and it's the cost is there, and the police are also still there, unfortunately. That's what I would.
Thank you.
I first would like to make a comment on the gender sensitivity of these various instruments. The Council of Europe Convention, even more than the Palermo Protocol, very much stresses the need for a gender balance. There is an article on that. But ironically, in our recommendations, we have turned it around, because we have the feeling that in many European countries, there is exclusive attention for female victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation. And there is very little awareness even of the problems of males who become victims of forced labor, of labor exploitation. And there is also neglect in many countries for the problems of child victims of both sexual exploitation and labor exploitation. So in many of our reports, which you can study on our website, we have reports on all 40 or so member states. You will see we always criticize the fact that there are shelter homes only for female victims, and that there are no provisions at all in many countries for male victims, which is really not in compliance with the convention obligation. So it's very interesting that we have turned around, in a way, in our recommendations, the requirement to be balanced in terms of gender. Now, about the other major, maybe the dominant issue of this workshop, that is that the human trafficking legal instruments are used against immigration, and how can we turn that around? Now, interestingly, the Council of Europe Convention has, in the paragraph on prevention, an article on the need of the state parties to promote regular migration. It's in the convention. It's not a strongly worded recommendation, but it is there. So there is an anchor there. It says that, for instance, by providing adequate information on migration requirements. So it's in the convention. What I think is more important and also practically important is that, according to the convention, someone who has been identified as a victim of human trafficking should at least the state party should consider to give them a residence permit for humanitarian reasons. And that is really of practical importance for quite a number of people across Europe. And I see a movement there, interestingly, maybe against the political drift, that more and more countries are willing to offer residence permits for humanitarian reasons. This hardly happened ever 20 years ago. Italy was the first, I think, who started to do that, but now the majority of countries offer residence permits to identified victims for humanitarian reasons. So that is a little bit of a counter flow in this respect.
Thank you. So we'll proceed with the set of 3 questions. I think there are 2 down here and 1 up, or at least 2 down up here. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, Quinn Kepish from Verite. I don't really have the answers, but was just wondering from you guys. I've seen some issues around challenges with regulation of both recruitment and migration, in that there's a push to better regulate migration and regularize migration, but creation of guest worker visas in many cases actually creates more vulnerability than if an undocumented worker came to a country. And we've done research here in the States, for example, in which we found that there's inherent menace of penalty of deportation if you switch employer, even if that employer is violating the law or the provisions of a contract. And so that's not necessarily the answer. Likewise, we found that regulation of recruitment can increase the cost of migration, right? So if you have exit visa requirements that are meant to protect workers from being exploited abroad, those can actually result in incurring fees amongst migrants, who then become further indebted. It also opens up the way to corruption and bribery, which further increase the cost. So again, I don't really have the answers, but was just wondering if you guys had seen any success cases, best practices, in regulating these kinds of things around the globe that we might be able to apply.
Thank you. So getting back to the reclaiming the mobility market, as Hernan phrased it.
Hi, this is Hannah Tignani from UNHCR. My question is kind of maybe taking advantage of the fact that there are so many lawyers in one place, and this is very unusual for me. But it was kind of building up Julie's comments about, you were talking about naming things, and it'll be a bit random, but I'll get there in a second. So does the definition, like a binary definition of a human trafficking victim, actually help the person? And the reason this comes up is that you see that we call people human trafficking victims, or the perpetrator, the trafficker, when they're low-skilled or semi-skilled victims. And if it was me or you or anyone in this room, we would say we were kidnapped, and then, I don't know all the terminology, but we were held against our will, and we were abused, or whatever, attempted murder, or whatever we want to call it. But is victim, like human trafficking or human trafficker, the best thing we should be calling it? Could we be breaking it down into other things that would get more justice for the victim?
Thank you.
My name is Nick Masinski. I'm from City University of New York. My question is for Hernan. Can you talk a little bit more about MSF's decision to not take EU money and also not work in the hotspots, and the more recent decision to not be in the Mediterranean or go down, and its impact on access to victims?
Yeah. Okay. Do you mind if we take one more panelist? No? Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carland, and I'm from Boston College. I'm a student there. And I just this is more directed toward Amira. I want to ask more about your work, just because you mentioned something that I think isn't as salient in our cultural context, which is the relation between human trafficking and marriage in a Muslim context. And I wanted to know if you found cases of divorce, or maybe some type of prototype of divorce, and the cases of like recidivism, where possibly spouses go back to the trafficking cycle because of some kind of Stockholm syndrome, like, yeah.
Thank you. So how would you like to take these? A lot of questions that I think can be picked up by any one of you, so maybe we can go from Hernan.
Okay, I'll give it a go. For Quinn, I don't have a solution, Quinn. I guess any policy solution will have its downsides, right? You mentioned them. I guess what I question is the particular downsides of the current policy, which is, as we heard over lunch, the price that we're paying is leaving people in arbitrary detention with known human rights abuses in Libya, right? And that seems particularly brutal, right? I mean, I can imagine that there are other policy solutions that will have downsides. This is not just a downside, right? This is a very deliberate attempt to keep people out of sight, or just not to pick on Europe anymore, right? Let's take Australia, right? The Australian model of keeping refugees. So I guess the issue is like, every policy, I would agree with you that they are all problematic, or they will create, everything has a side effect. But this is, I mean, the prescription is brutal, right? It's amputation when you actually could, take a pill, and I think it's, that's the way I see it, but I would leave other people to. Then with the second question around victim, I sympathize with that. I think it's, there's a little movie, it's online, it's called Becky's Journey. It's by an anthropologist, the Danish anthropologist, that works now in Colombia, I think she is. And it's about a Nigerian woman, 26 years old, that she follows, she does an ethnography, she follows her through her 3 attempts to get to Europe. She dies in the 3rd attempt. And through interviewing her, you realize that the notion of, there's a lot of agency there. There's a lot of decisions made that they are very rational within their within the context, and it leaves you very, very uncomfortable with the notion of victim, the notion that those people are being trafficked. No, there's very rational thinking around those things, sometimes with very poor outcomes, with very limited choices. But I think there is a lot. I mean, the filmmaker who did this, Sine, who's the person I mentioned, she's very critical. She says, just cut that crap about trafficking. This is something else. So I think there is a critique to that, and I think it needs to be heard, but within limits. And then maybe I leave the MSF one for the end, because I think people should. But I'll go back to that if they give it time.
Oh, you would like to leave that for the end?
I'll leave it for the end, because probably people want to engage. I mean,
for sure, yes.
Yeah.
So I just want to jump in on the victim question. I find this area of law really fascinating because, trafficking, we've talked about various issues. Trafficking is a complex social problem, right? Whether we're talking about inequality, poverty, racism, all these various things. And so there's a question about what is the utility of this framework of trafficking. And there is a risk of this overlay of trafficking in drawing attention away from all of these other problems, saying that it's about the trafficker protecting the survivor and punishing the trafficker, but we're not getting at these issues. So that that's one issue and problem with the labeling. Obviously, it's helpful. The term trafficking can be enormously helpful when the person qualifies as a victim, say under federal law, in terms of receiving immigration benefits if they are successful, which can be really challenging, opening the door to civil recovery, which was talked about yesterday, or criminal restitution or other things. And so, there is a utility to that definition. But I think also, just to go back to the presentation, as we expand through law that definition, it's it's going to conflict or at least butt up against other frameworks. And so, you know, one of the examples is this buying of sex with children. In Valle talked yesterday, they have a really robust approach to that in Seattle, and it doesn't use the trafficking construct. They have a crime that's called commercial sexual abuse of children. As he mentioned, they prosecuted 170 people last year using that approach. And so if you think prosecution is the answer, they're labeling it in a different way. And whether I think one big question is, you know, should trafficking replace that? Is there a utility, or should there be a dialogue among those two approaches?
Well, yeah, I would like to comment also a bit on the labeling. GRETA has for years now very much recommended a broad definition of forced labor, because that's where the problem is. There are several jurisdictions in Europe where the courts simply refuse to convict anyone for the crime of forced labor because they do not understand the concept. And the fact that we now use the label of modern slavery in the UK, but increasingly elsewhere in Europe, is not helpful either, because the concept of slavery is about someone in chains. And this is precisely what is not happening. There is less and less physical violence, certainly in Europe, around forced labor. There is a lot of abuse of positions of vulnerability and psychological pressure, very smart, sophisticated ways to put pressure on people, but hardly any violence, and the courts still don't get it. So this is one of the recurrent themes in our recommendations, that the courts, because we cannot blame the police that they do not arrest such people, and the prosecutors that they do not prosecute, if there will never be any convictions. There needs to be a broader concept of forced labor, and fortunately, last year, the European Court of Human Rights has issued a ruling on the definition of forced labor, which it was a ruling against Greece. It was a case where in Greece, people had to work in a farm. There was a lot of pressure on them, but they could leave. And that's why the Greek court said, we cannot convict them for forced labor because they had the liberty to go home after having worked there for 2 years without wages. But anyway, they could go home. The European Court of Human Rights has demolished that thinking, fortunately. So I'm very sensitive to the importance of labeling, but my personal opinion is that both trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery, they are all the wrong labels. I would prefer criminal exploitation. That seems to be the best technical term.
Amira, would you like to take it up?
Yes. Thanks. So yeah, thank you for question about the marriage and human trafficking. I didn't know that's also happening in Boston, if I got you right. So maybe we need to talk about that after.
If you can bring the microphone closer.
Okay. But at least where I worked in Jordan and Egypt with IOM. Well, I just want to say that, you know, sexual exploitation can happen in so many forms, but I see that, you know, it's happening mainly through marriage, but there are also other forms, you know, prostitution and commercial sex work. When I was in Jordan working with Syrian refugees, there was a correspondent from The Guardian who came to investigate the issue about the situation of Syrian refugees, and he learned about this issue of early forced, you know, whatever you call it, marriage for girls underage. He was roaming around, and he interviewed me, and then I got interviewed by The Independent, by The Guardian, and I was just like quoted, you know, hugely in newspapers saying that, oh, they are vulnerable and they're doing it as economic strategy. But then Jordan, the government started to respond to that. Well, I want to tell you also about the correspondent. He went to a nightclub. I think it was called the Blue Elephant or something in Jordan. And then he came across a Syrian woman. And she wrote something on a piece of paper and she passed it to him. So that piece of paper told her trafficking story. She was trafficked into and exploited sexually in that nightclub. So he came to us, he reported to us. I talked to the Jordanian authorities. I spoke also to UNHCR, and they reached out to her, and she was I mean, this is very risky, but that was a successful story. She was assisted and rescued from the trafficking situation. But also in Jordan, when we were there, we organized orientation, awareness-raising campaigns or information campaigns where we brought Jordanians, this is a demand and supply, Jordanians and Syrians together to do like waste management campaigns. It was demanded by the local authorities that because of the huge number of Syrians arriving into the country, the waste issue is becoming a crisis now. So we thought we can do some intervention in that to help the citizen, but also the refugees. And during the campaign, it was like, a big celebration, and we distributed lots of counter-trafficking messages. And I think that was some good efforts. We did it in the 3 largest cities hosting Syrian refugees. We also, as I said earlier, we identified a number of Syrian families who are at high risk, and we give them direct assistance, which is support them with rent and other things. But most importantly, because this marriage, it's mainly, usually, I mean, the story of, like a 17, 15 years old Syrian who an Arab or Jordanian came to and married her for $3,000, spent 20 days, he went to restaurants and hotel, and then boom, he disappeared. This is like a very common story. So the Jordanian authorities, even though the age of marriage in Jordan is 18, they made some compromise, like some arrangements to register the marriage, even if the girl is divorced now. So they made some exceptions for this marriage. Now they have a judge sitting in the Ministry of Interior who registers this sort of marriages. In Egypt also, the law, as I said, the Egyptian law is very advanced in that area because it recognized this sort of marriage as sexual trafficking. And also, the Mufti of Egypt issued a fatwa saying that this is haram sort of marriage, and this is not an Islamic marriage at all. But also, interestingly, the Minister of Justice, he issued a decree, or whatever you call it, saying that, to guarantee that Egyptian women are not trafficked, so any Egyptian woman who get married to a foreigner, and the age gap between them 25 years old, he has to pay 50,000 pounds, which is probably $2,000. So just to guarantee her rights. So I'm sure he did with good intention, but you can see that this is also can be very controversial. So the thing is that, as I said, the issue is very controversial. When it comes to marriage, some conservative, families believe that this is marriage. This is like a legal marriage and under Islamic law. So I mean, there are efforts, and people are talking about it. In Egypt now, there are lots of, again, awareness-raising campaigns against that. But again, people divide it. So they can forge, the age, the birth certificate of the girl, just to put her in that sort of marriage. But also, as I said, more important, this is an economic survival strategy for the family. So if you don't really address the root causes of, poverty and unemployment, I think it wouldn't be, work for, it will not be sustained, these efforts, unless you address the root causes. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess we could either go back to Hernan with the question specific to MSF, or Amira, if you wanted to speak about the definitional labeling issues. Perhaps respond to Jan's comment about commercial exploitation as an alternative to the framing of modern slavery or trafficking.
Well, I'm really confused in this, all these definitions, and not only in trafficking, also in migration, What is the difference between asylum seeker, refugee, vulnerable migrant, so many definitions, IDP, internally displaced person, and there are so many definitions. And in academia, in our ivory tower, no offense for any scholar who's sitting here, we talk about, we should look at, refugees and forced migration, as part of population movements and border crossing, which is really very advanced. But when you come to reality, no, a refugee should be identified as a refugee. So because he is entitled or she is entitled to a certain assistance provisions that should be provided to them. But then also, this is even more complicated because in Egypt, for example, refugees are much more privileged than people who were not recognized as refugees. So in IOM, for example, we give priority to vulnerable migrants, not to refugees, because refugees are well taken care of. They are legally protected somehow, of course. Yeah, but at least, you can speak this language with the government. You can say, oh, he's a recognized refugee. So they can talk to you about that. But when you say vulnerable migrants, it's just like, get out of here, I mean, we have so many problems in our country. We don't need more vulnerable people in this country. So the labeling issue really, really needs to be addressed. We know that the 1951 Refugee Convention came into place in a certain circumstances, like global circumstances. It was like a very historical moment, very specific historical moment that's irrelevant at the moment. I don't advocate, of course, against the convention. Can you imagine if the convention is not there? Many people will be really in a very bad position. So it should be there, but while it is there, we need to work on it. I mean, the definition of refugee is not enough at the moment. I know that my answer is making things even more complicated, but I'm doing this on purpose, honestly. So when it comes to trafficking, it's even more complicated because the US, the TV, how do you call it? TV visa. Yeah. So it came to existence, I think, before the International Convention, before the UN Convention. But then in the Middle East, in the Arab world, all the domestic laws came, of course, through like pressure, a lot of pressure from international community to enact their own domestic legislations. So they did that, but they copied and pasted Palermo Protocol. So you feel like, you're giving me, like a jacket that's size 6, and I'm size 20. I'm not 20, but so this is what's happening now. That we are adopting laws that are made for somewhere else. A bunch of experts sat together and they put that from their perspective. And for countries to respond to that, they just copied it as it is. So it's not really working. So this applies to so many things. I mean, the definition of trafficking. Go to Sudan, for example, where many victims of trafficking are internally displaced and citizens. But the law talks about migrants and refugees coming from Ethiopia and Eritrea. So we are Sudanese, we're happy, we don't have any trafficking, and these are coming from abroad. And this is not only coming from abroad, but also these are the responsibility of international community. As you said, Barbara, earlier in your speech, this senior officer said to you, this is your problem. It's not our problem because it has nothing to do with Sudanese citizens. Even though if you look at the statistics in Sudan, you find the largest underage marriage is happening in Sudan. 54% of all marriages in Sudan are under 18, for girls under 18. So I think we need, and honestly, even though this conference advocates for addressing migration or trafficking in the lens of migration and this nexus, I advocate totally against that when we go to that part of the world. Because again, governments are taking the excuse that this is not us. Even though internal trafficking, go to Egypt, internal trafficking is just like incomparable. You cannot even compare it to what's happening among migrant communities. So, and also the definition is very vague. We know that, the Palermo Protocol defines, trafficking as, according to 3 elements: the act, the means, and the purpose. But these are very blurred and very vague and interpreted, differently by law enforcement. Those even who know about the law, many of them do not even know about the law. What I want to say that, again, in academia, we need to do a lot of work on migration terminologies, on labeling, on the repercussion, on the 1951. Legal scholars, we really need to work on that. the context is very important. You know, the one protocol that applies in the US does not apply in Eritrea. So my conclusion is that we need to revisit all these terminologies and definitions.
Thank you. Hernan?
Me? Yeah, I don't want to take a lot of time because I'm sure that people want to ask more questions. I mean, the question just was why did the organization I work with, MSF, decided to withdraw from taking European funding in the middle of the European crisis, meaning funding from the EU and from any EU member state. And it's true, we did that, and I think it was a bit a response to the critique that Olivier, some of the previous panels said. Look, NGOs are very naive. NGOs are not very naive, but they're also they run after money. So I don't want to discredit the whole sector, but the problem with that was amidst the EU-Turkey deal, the EU decides to give Erdogan 6 billion to keep not just Syrians and Afghans arriving to from Europe, from arriving into Greece, but also turning a blind eye to the fact that the Turkish border remained closed, the border with Syria, right? So it's basically trapping Syrians in a place in which they are being bombed. So we thought that policy was really objectionable. Within the package of measures was doubling the size of ECHO, which is the European agency for funding emergencies. And therefore, what was the ECHO money for? To pay NGOs to go and provide services in Turkey. We knew there were enough NGOs willing to go and take that money, which we objected. We discussed with them. We just also knew that we were not going to be one of them. We have a very strict policy of not taking money definitely not from governments that are involved in a particular conflict, right? We're not going to be taking whatever British money in Yemen. But once you start trying to clean up your act and saying, listen, let's really limit our sources of funding and not play to the political agenda or the foreign policy, the famous Colin Powell force multipliers of a war effort. Then I mean, following down that road, this is the last station. We have dropped American money before, we have dropped it. And yeah, the result is that we decided, it was a very heated debate inside the organization, but we decided that we'd no longer take European money either, because it's contradictory. I mean, the policy on refugees is contradictory to what we're trying to achieve. And not working in hotspots is the same thing. It's these hotspots and this idea of there is money for you guys to go and work there and keep those refugees there, reception in the regions. We don't have a problem working in the region. We assist the majority of refugees, we assist Syrians, it's around Syria. But we don't believe that's a substitute that can justify keeping Syrians out of Europe. So that's why we didn't work in the hotspots, and that's why we currently work in Libya in detention centers. But we are utterly and openly critical of the fact that Europe is willing to pay for detention of people that are arbitrarily detained and that shouldn't be detained. So we walk that very fine line in terms of we still believe that our presence there has a value because people live in horrific conditions. But up to what point you can still be there and remain present when you're frankly pissing off the Libyans every time you say something. So it might be short-lived, like some of the things we do. But I think that the aid sector in general needs a very much closer scrutiny. And that includes UN agencies, includes, I'm not going to name, but there's a lot that needs to be asked when you see the kind of statements or the kind of things that NGOs or UN agents are willing to implement. And maybe when I said naive at the beginning, maybe it's not, maybe we're not naive. Maybe there is a lack of an ethical approach of what you're doing. So that's the reason, basically.
Thank you so much for this principled explanation of MSF's policy. I think one aspect of the question was about whether there's been an impact on the service provision, if I understood correctly.
Look, I mean, frankly, with some of the things we've said about migration, we lost, most of our funding is from private donors, not on institutional donors. So we have a lot of people calling our office saying, like, I don't want to support this organization anymore because you're bringing these people to Europe when those boats. So we have that. It hasn't had an impact in terms of what we're able to do. Because we also had other people that said, like, no, I didn't know about it, but I want to support this organization because I think this is worth. But today, I mean, immigration is one of the most divisive political debates in Europe, in this country as well. And for agencies that depend on money, whether it's from governments or from the public, it's whatever. I mean, if you take a position on the issue, it's. I mean, trust me, my fundraising director was not happy when I said, "Okay, let's go and let's drop the European." With everything, there's an internal discussion, but in the end, what are you there for, right?
No, thanks so much, everyone. I want to give an opportunity if there is someone who is dying to ask a question right now. We're really out of time, but there is only...
Overtime?
Yes. You're dying. Everyone's dying. Something very pressing.
There's a doctor here in the... If you're dying.
Otherwise, I'm sure that you will get an opportunity to converse directly with our wonderful panelists during the coffee break that we invite you to join us for. And thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.